Up next, we've got Tami Ransom. She is a associate professor here at Salisbury University and chair of the Department of Environmental Studies. She's here to talk a little bit about reptiles, amphibians, and fire.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so excuse me. As you said, I am with the Department of Environmental Studies. I am a biologist by training. I've worked or studied organisms from ground nesting warblers. I did my PhD on native and invasive earthworms. And since about 2016, I've been working with spotted turtles here on the Delmarva Peninsula. And also just last fall, put out some cover boards to look at reptiles and amphibians on TNC property in burned and unburned habitat. But for this talk, I'm just going to give a very broad general overview of reptiles, amphibians, and fire, and some recommendations. So I'm first going to start talking about some activity patterns of the reptiles and amphibians in Maryland and give some case studies, not necessarily from here, but in general, what people have seen effects of fires are on reptiles and amphibians, and then some recommendations and resources. Oh, went too far. Okay, so obviously we've heard fire is going to depend on what taxa you're working with, whether it's plants or animals, quails. And so it's going to depend on the region, the habitats, the taxa. And, you know, we always lump reptiles and amphibians together, but they have very different life history strategies. So because of that, their responses to fire are going to be very different. So if you're trying to manage for frogs versus turtles versus salamanders, that's going to be very different. And even we have aquatic turtles, we have semi-aquatic turtles, we have terrestrial turtles. Same thing, we have salamanders that are more terrestrial or more aquatic. So there's no one size fits all for managing for them. As we've heard here on Delmarva, we have a historic fire regime. And so the reptiles and amphibians, their habitats, their food sources, those are all dependent on fire and its effects. So even as I go through, some of the studies will show short-term negative impacts on the reptiles and amphibians, but I think long-term, we obviously need fire in this system to manage for them. And so I'm going to go through this next part for these activity patterns for the herpetofauna in Maryland pretty quickly and not point out too many species. But the bottom line for these is, in terms of reptiles and amphibians, it's different for other things. But the best time usually for prescribed burns is when they are dormant or in brumation. And so around here, you know, that's going to be November, December, January. Obviously, it depends on the year. So these are frogs. We all know we hear frogs in the summertime. During the winter, most of the time, as long as it's cold, they're brumating and they're not active. And that's a great time to do prescribed burns. Salamanders, again, they have different life history strategies. So redback salamanders, they will go down under the ground, but they're often in the leaf litter lots of time, like even when it warms up in the middle of winter, even the Appalachian Mountains where I've studied them before. And so, I mean, they're on the, I don't know how to do this. I'm not even going to try. There we go. All right, so they could be active. They're very common though, so we're not too worried about mortality for them. Tiger salamanders, eastern tiger salamanders, they actually, in this, you know, peak time where it'd be great to be burning in the middle of winter, if they migrate to their breeding ponds. So they are fossorial large portion of the year. They migrate to these breeding ponds often in January with the first warm rain. And so you just to kind of keep that in mind and be aware if you're in an area where there might be eastern tiger salamanders. And turtles, like the frogs, they are going to be inactive for most of the winter around here. Same thing with lizards. And again, same thing for snakes. So like I said, fairly quickly through those, but that's that you can refer back to those, thinking about when is a good time when you're not going to disturb them. So early spring, that's when pretty much reptiles and amphibians, they start moving around. That is not the best time if you were trying to protect or to reduce mortality. You could have more mortalities if you're burning when they're moving around. So the case studies that I have, most of the data I could find were from the Midwest, Appalachian Mountains, and some for the southern coastal plain. That's longleaf pine forest, for a little different from here. If when I'm done, if people have examples from around here and want to chime in, I'm happy to hear. If you have some more up-to-date examples. And a lot of these case studies are from short-term studies where they've done a burn and they compare burned and unburned sites, and they're just looking at kind of often negative short-term effects rather than the kind of longer-term effects that providing these burned habitats is going to, over time, it's going to improve habitat quality for these species. And like anything, because reptiles and amphibians are so different, the results often differ among the studies. So I'm just going to go by taxa and give a couple examples for each of the taxa. So this first example is for snakes in longleaf pine forest. And so in this study, it was in North Carolina, longleaf pine forest, which is a fire-dependent habitat. And they found here that specialist snakes, so Florida pine snake, eastern coachwhip, eastern diamondback rattlesnake, which we don't have here, but they selected habitats that had a narrow range of fire frequencies. So they like to be in habitats that were burned pretty frequently, less than every 2.5 years. Even the generalist species like the king snake and the gray rat snake, they were in habitats that were burned a broader range of fire frequencies from 2 to 10 years, but even those generalists were not found as frequently, or they avoided areas that weren't burned at least every 10 years. And so they're adapted to these landscapes that have relatively frequent burns. So overall with this study, and I think it would be true for here as well, snakes are going to thrive in areas that are burned more frequently. They like those kind of open habitat areas. Similarly, lizards, and with both snakes and lizards, you know, they can kind of move out of the way for fire and move back in relatively quickly. And this study is from Alabama. And in this study, they did both thinning, they had controls, they did thinning, and they had different intensity of burns. So low intensity burns or no burns. And in this study, what they found is kind of a busy slide, but for number of trap nights, and this is looking at lizards, and they found, you see these largest bars here, lizards counts were greatest 2 years after treatment in thinned and burned plots. So both thinning and burning increase the diversity of lizards on these plots. For salamanders, burns may not have that much effect on fossorial salamanders like spotted salamanders or tiger salamanders when they're burrowed under the ground. And again, as long as they're not migrating to or from breeding ponds, which is a really relatively short period of time. Tiger salamanders is often only a couple days or a week. And so impacts might be seen more on things like I mentioned, the redback salamander, pretty common. They're a food source for lots of different species, mammals, birds, but they're very common. They live in the leaf litter. They might be more impacted by prescribed burns. One of my few case studies from kind of near this area up by Chestertown, Chesapeake Farms. This is way back in 1998, but they did, again, the study itself didn't look far into the future, but they looked at burned and unburned. And you can see here that the reptiles and amphibians did not, they were lower in the burn versus the unburned stands. That being said, again, this is short term, and I'm all in favor of prescribed burns. And I think long term, it's going to benefit even these species. And even these in the wetland areas, they're going to be protected and have places to go. Reptiles, similar, a little bit less abundant in burn, but a couple of species were more abundant in burned stands than unburned. And again, this is short term. Long term, I think you'd see the diversity go up. For frog species, the example I have, this was in Virginia. And here they just looked at Cope's tree frogs. And in this study, they found that burning did not alter tree frog abundances in forests. So they sampled the tree frogs using these nice little PVC pipe refugia to make surveying them a little bit easier. And they found that, the frogs, the burning versus not burning, they like the stands equally well. There was a little bit of impact on the water quality, and it impacted the tadpoles short term for one season after the study. But looking at it, it seemed that the tree frogs were prioritizing adult habitat over the tadpole habitat. And so overall, the burns didn't have an impact on those tree frogs. The one taxa of reptiles and amphibians that is often impacted by burns is turtles. I don't know if any of you have, I've been a couple places after, even maybe probably like years after a burn, and you can see, sometimes you see turtle shells from, they've been caught. Because a lot of, if they're not underground, if they're active, a turtle's response is just to hunker down in its shell. And so if you have a high intensity burn, it's the turtle's going to be injured. And so this is from Michigan, and this is a radiotelemetry turtle, and you can see it's got some scarring from a fire. And a lot of studies show that things like box turtles, and I've seen mud turtles before as well, have mortality rates from prescribed burns. Again, I think this can be kind of remedied a little bit if you're trying to do it when they are not active. So in the coldest months of the year. A study in Illinois found, and that's not relevant to here, and I couldn't find a similar study for here, but if you did the burns, I think it was like 10 to 20 degrees. I don't remember if it was Fahrenheit or Celsius, but cold weather in Illinois, then the mortality was reduced to about nothing. So another article, and this was in North Carolina, in heavily burned areas. So again, this might be a little bit different than prescribed burns where the fire's moving pretty quickly. They had mortality up to 50%, and this can be pretty significant for turtles, which are long-lived. They're usually slow breeding. So, but they will use burn refugia. And again, if it's in the winter, with the spotted turtles I'm working with, with the radio telemetry, we see in the wintertime, they're usually hunkered down pretty well in January and even into February. And so spotted turtles are semi-aquatic. They go to breeding ponds to breed. In the wintertime, sometimes they'll move away from ponds. They're underneath the ground. A fire wouldn't affect them at that point in time. Or they'll often just hunker down on the edges of ponds deep in the mud. Again, they would be protected at that point. Once they start moving for breeding in the early spring, and around here with spotted turtles, that's anywhere from late February to March, then that they would be more likely to be impacted. That being said, this study was on box turtles, and they found that actually the turtles preferred nesting in open tree canopies. So areas that had been burned that were open, the turtles preferred to nest there and to lay their eggs in those open areas because it's more favorable for incubation. And I think that would be true for spotted turtles too with prescribed burns, because a lot of the areas where they're nesting, the nests are not, they'd rather nest in sandier soils and areas where it's more open. So I think burns can improve habitat for turtles, even as you try to be a little careful about mortality. So some sources for, if you're interested in trying to protect or look at reptiles and amphibians, this is from Midwest Park Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. There's also a Northeast Park, but they didn't have quite as good guidelines in terms of prescribed burns. And so if you identify the herpetofauna that you have on your site prior to large-scale management, that's always helpful. Here in Maryland, we have that Maryland Biodiversity Project, which is a great website that has a lot of information on the abundances and what species are present for, the insects, reptiles, amphibians, mammals. They have an excellent website looking at county level to see what species are there, and they have other records as well. And the Maryland Amphibian and Reptile Atlas, MAR, that's where I got those maps. I don't know if it's still active online, but I'm sure we could dig it up somewhere. But they have good resources as well for what reptiles and amphibians are at the quad level for every place in Maryland. And so further recommendations looking for is to, so obviously burns near wetlands may interfere with salamander breeding migrations, but again, if it is when they're not doing their migrations, it's usually not a problem. Winter fires could expose hibernating frogs and terrestrial salamanders to mortality, but I don't think it's that much of a problem because most of them, even if they're, underneath the soil, just a little bit, they're going to be protected. Early spring burns, you have to worry about those for emerging reptiles and amphibians, such as box turtles emerging from hibernation or brumation. And then in later spring and early summer burns could impact nesting turtles as well. So, and I think around here, we don't usually burn in late spring, early summer, but I could be wrong about that. And if you have snake hibernaculum on a site, you don't want to burn near them while the snakes are still in there in the winter, because that could impact a large portion of the population. So late fall, winter months, great for reptiles and amphibians. Most of them are going to be inactive. And if you have kind of low intensity, quickly moving fire, you're going to have the fewest impacts with reptiles and amphibians. And long term, I think opening up habitats, maintaining some of these kind of meadow habitats and the diversity of habitat is going to increase reptile and amphibian populations. So there's few long-term studies, but the bottom line is know your species and the area where they are and the habits. And if you do that, you can have, healthy communities. I won't try I didn't embed my video, but it's a wetland swamp that has spadefoot toads coursing. I'll just let you have a mental image of that as we go through. So, and with that, I know lunch is our next thing. So, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, does someone have a quick question? We'll take one awesome question before we head off to lunch. Everybody got one?
I have one. You mentioned that winter's the best. If you had to look at the whole, anytime from March through September, is there some times that are worse than others? Would you say midsummer, late summer?
I would say late summer would be best then, because by then most things are done breeding. So reptiles and amphibians, they usually like get out there and start doing their thing. So I think early spring would be the worst time. But then, later in the summer, late spring, I know from having done reptile and amphibian surveys like on Poplar Island, it really slows down late July, August, September. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thanks,
All right,
Tami.
thanks.